There is a time for everything, like we learned in Ecclesiastes Chapter 3. There's a time for everything. God's sovereign over every season. That's what we've learned. God placed eternity in our hearts, excuse me, and yet we cannot grasp that whole point, okay? We can't grasp all of that eternity. We are finite and called to live humbly and joyfully before Him, okay? Both humbly and joyfully, okay? So lean in on that. And as we move into chapter 4, we're going to get the setup for this chapter, which is that the teacher, Solomon, is now observing social realities. We see oppression, envy, loneliness, and power. This chapter highlights how broken relationships and selfish ambition lead to despair, and unless redeemed by compassion and community. Okay? So those will result to despair unless it becomes redeemed by compassion and community. All right? Remember that as we walk into chapter 4. Okay, so with 4, verses 1 through 3, let's read that first. Again, I looked and I saw all the oppression that was taken place under the sun. I saw the tears of the oppressed, and they have no comforter. Power was on the side of their oppression, and they have no comforter. And I declared that the dead who had already died are happier than the living who are still alive. But better than both is he who has not yet been, who has not seen the evil that is done under the sun. There's some big things in this section, all right? The teacher, Solomon, King Solomon, sees the fears of the oppressed. No one comforts them, okay? He sees power is on the side of the oppressors. He sees that somehow they're winning in their achievements. He says the dead are better off than the living. Better yet are those not yet born. So he is saying, from his perspective, it seems like death is a release, an escape from release is peaceful. From his perspective, Sheol and Hades seems like sleep. Okay, and so in that sense, he is making the he's making an assumption that the life that we toil under this oppression is worse than being dead. Okay, he's making that distinction, and then he's saying that the dead, or better yet, those who have not been born yet, are even better because they have not been born and they haven't died yet. And so this is quite an interesting section, because this really hones in on the suffering, and we've talked about the whole book of Job. Okay, what's happening with suffering? Okay, is that it's a long series, so go check that out if you haven't seen those VODs on my channel, but it's interesting to learn, and it's things we need to think about. So there's a deep lament over unchecked justice. The teacher is not promoting death. He's not promoting that death is something to run to. Okay, he's not saying, "Oh, go to better off just kill ourselves." He's not saying that, but expressing grief over a world without comforters. He's expressing that. Okay, and a world without justice feels meaningless and hopeless. And so, again, without God, there is no justice. Okay, with God, there's justice, and having that part and understanding in God's character is so vital in understanding how everything comes into place. Okay, so in terms of suffering, I'm not going to give you a quick answer. I'm just going to say that suffering has a lot of layers of purpose, okay? And we cannot just dive into that with one sentence, okay? With a simple sentence. So, yeah, again, I would encourage you to go check out my Job series and then read Job for yourself as well to see really the underlying tones of purpose for suffering, because or even better yet, read Isaiah 53 to get a full picture of the suffering servant and the purpose of his suffering for on our behalf. Okay, so with that being said, what we can learn from this section is, well, thinking through certain questions like, are we aware of suffering around us? Do we avoid suffering? How can we be a comforter to the oppressed in our own contexts? And do you long for God's justice or rely on worldly power? So which one is that? So with that being said, let's move on to verses 4 through 6. This is about envy, ambition, and contentment, okay? So let's read that section. And I saw that all labor and all achievements spring from man's envy of his neighbor. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. The fool holds his hands and ruins himself. Better one handful with tranquility than two handfuls with toil and chasing after the wind. Okay, let's look at that. So what we are observing from this text is that people's toil and achievement spring from envy of their neighbor. Okay, this too is meaningless. It's a chasing after the wind. That envy or leading to jealousy, those are things, coveting something that isn't ours, just completely a meaningless task and effort for us. Because we don't have those circumstances in our own lives, okay? But this is contrasted in this text with laziness, folded hands, okay? So he's saying that they're envying all these things from other people while they're just folding their hands and just waiting and lazy, And then this image of contentment, one handful with rest, okay? So if they have one handful and then the rest, okay? The rest as in break or sleep. That's that sort of rest, okay? So yeah. So what he's saying here is that the teacher King Solomon, is critiquing both extremes. He's critiquing a ruthless ambition that just is aimless and a passive laziness. He's critiquing both of them. And there's an ideal. The ideal is to be quiet contentment, not driven by compassion. Why is that? Why does he make this kind of why do we get this kind of meaning from his teaching? What's the purpose of him giving us this teaching? Because, what is it about our own compassions that could lead us astray? What is it about it? So I thought compassion was a good thing, but what happens, when our compassion is driven by motives of impure motives, because we can have compassion in all the wrong areas and all the wrong things. So is compassion really something we should strive for? Do we only get fulfillment when we are or working through our skills and abilities with compassion? And I'm saying that in a general worldly sense, without God, without trusting in God, this compassion, it drives us. It's not a compassion is not a compass like of north. It's not north, okay? It's not the compass that we should be pointing to, okay? That's my point, I guess, here. And so are our goals fueled by comparison or calling? What does a one handful with tranquility look like in your own life? And where do you need to stop striving and start resting in God? So where do you need to stop striving and start resting in God? So there's a lot in that section, but let's move on to verses 7 and 8, which is the lonely worker. The lonely worker says, "Again, I saw something meaningless under the sun. There was a man all alone. He had neither son nor brother. There was no end to his toil, yet his eyes were not content with his wealth. For whom am I toiling?" he asked. "And why am I depriving myself of enjoyment? This too is meaningless. A miserable business." So there's a man working tirelessly, yet he has no one to share that work with. He never stops to ask, who am I working for? Okay. So wealth and success, this text is showing us that wealth and success without relationship is completely empty. This section connects to the dangers of self-centered labor. Like, life becomes all about toil and no joy. This is a temptation for us to just spend time in our own labor and centered around our own self. But when we work in teams, in a community, things are a little bit more balanced in the terms of finding satisfaction in the work we do. It's all about that communal aspect, okay? Because are we passing down that work for someone else? I can say this very simply now because I'm speaking broadly in terms of all kinds of career paths that you could take. Like in anything that you do, you're working for other people in some way, shape, or form. You're working for other people. So what does that look like for us? Like in terms of our labor, is it centered on just getting our work done and going? Is it meaningless, that the work that we're doing, or are we doing that work for customers or for people, clients, and etc.? Those kind of things. So life becomes all about toil and no joy when we focus our work centered only around us and not community and networking and all of those things that require that communication with other people. We're missing a whole lot if we center our work on just ourselves. Okay. And this we can see that there's layers of worth within this section, but again, without God, ultimately this even this work for others is pointless and meaningless as well. So let's learn from this section. What do we let's see. Do we work to impress or to connect? That's the question. Do we work to impress someone or to connect with someone? Are there relationships that you are neglecting for the sake of success? So that's tied to that question. And also, who are we inviting into our lives to share this journey with? All right, so with that said, let's move to verses 9 through 12. This is about the value of companionship. So we're getting more of a glimpse on that section, the community. So let's read it. Two are better than one because they have a good return for their work. If one fails or falls down, his friend can help him up. But pity the man who falls and has no one to help him up. Also, if two lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? Though one may be overpowered, two can defend themselves. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken. Now this is some interesting stuff to break down. A great point. So what we have observed here is that 2 is better than 1, right? This support system with having at least 2 or more around you. Support, labor in warmth and in defense, okay? There's a cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken. A cord of a single strand can just be snapped. Okay, so we're seeing here that this companionship and this community is vital and important for sustaining meaning, to keep meaning, okay, and to keep sight of that meaning, okay. So what it's saying here is that companionship provides strength and resilience and joy. And the final line hints at community or divine presence, possibly even a reflection of the Godhead. Okay? Godhead is made up of 3 persons. Eternal, each of them are eternal persons, but separate in persons, but in essence the same divine being. Okay? Or, yeah. God is one, okay? And he's in 3 persons. So the Godhead is like a strand, a cord that is not broken, like a single strand cord. Now that triune nature, that triune model, is used for everything else in life. We see that triune model within dimensions. We got width, length, and height. We see that in let's see, yeah. There's all kinds of different points, and with 3, like, yeah, you can make a distinction of our body, soul, and spirit, depending on how you interpret those terms, spirit and soul, and body. You can separate those 3 and have those. There's, well, not completely separate, but those 3 components are sort of like a model of the Godhead, of in a way. It's not perfect, again, because we don't really understand the Godhead fully in our own terms, and how we can't really define it well in human terminology. Okay, but in the sense, we are made of 3 parts, but are one being. Okay, and then but again, that's just a small example of the Godhead. But let's get back to this point, is that the final line hints that community aspect, okay? And what I wanted to make is, even when we're praying with people, if we have 2 or 3 gathered together to pray, there's a companionship, but there's also a support as we continue to grow and ask God for the needs in our lives. It's just a lot easier to be in the presence of other saints, other believers, okay? So, yeah. And so what are we, so who are our 2 or 3 in our life, okay? So who are your 2 or 3 in your life, okay? Who are the 2 or 3 people in your life that you can depend on, and they can depend on you for? You have that communal companionship with, that can help you go through life, okay? Are you building deep spiritual friendships, or are you walking alone? How can you strengthen godly companionship? So, think about those things, but we'll move on to verses 13 through 16, which is about the fleeting nature of popularity and power, okay? Last section of this chapter. Better a poor but wise youth than an old but foolish king, who no longer knows how to take warning. The youth may have come from prison to the kingship, or he may have been born in poverty without his kingdom. I saw that all who lived and walked under the sun followed the youth, the king's successor. There was no end to all the people who were born them, but those who came later were not pleased with the successor. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. So what we have observed with this section, or what we can observe here, there's a lot we can observe in these sections, but I'm just pointing out a few things as we go in these streams. But we see a poor but wise youth is better than a foolish old king. So the youth rises to power, but eventually he too is also forgotten. Okay? Again, without God, this is ultimately a forgotten notion. It just, things drift into nothingness. Okay? Even influence and leadership don't last, and human glory fades, and the crowd is fickle. So, with that being said, are we chasing an influence, or are we living in faithfulness? How does remembering the brevity of fame or success shape your own goals? And what legacy are you truly leaving? What is the legacy you're leaving for the people behind you, or that will come after you, okay? I mean, these are things that we don't really, I don't know how often people ponder them in their own hearts, but these are things that I don't often think about too much either. So, but these are things that we have to think about. We have to think about meaning of life, but ultimately life comes through Christ. And that is the framework that we're living through, okay? That Christ Jesus makes everything new. And so when we lean on him, we continue to grow into the things that Christ has, the purpose that Christ has for us, okay? We continue to grow in our joy and in our faith and in our love for him and others around us. So this is very important for us, because without Christ Jesus, there is no legacy left behind. Okay, everything else will be forgotten and lost. Okay, so there's a lot there, but to kind of wrap up with a few more questions here for this chapter. Which image from this chapter challenged you the most? The oppression, the ambition, the loneliness, or the fleeting fame? Or maybe the three-strand cord? Which of these images challenge you the most? How can you embrace godly contentment and community for this week? And what is one change that you could make to live with greater compassion or relational depth? Okay, greater compassion, remembering that our motivations center on what kind of compassion. Our greater compassion. Where is the motivation of our compassion? Okay, what's our motivations lined up for or with. Okay, think about those kinds of things. And that relational depth. Are you making relations with people you can trust around you? Like, how are you gonna do that? Okay. Thanks for stopping on. I'm about to end our stream for today, but we just finished the chapter 4 breakdown of Ecclesiastes. It's been a good point, and so again, I'll just kind of recap of what these two chapters are about. We have a seasonality time in chapter 3, which we went over first, and then in chapter 4, oppression, toil, friendlessness, advancement being meaningless. Okay, and so the time for everything. That chapter showed us how God has a purpose in everything in His timing. Okay, and then we line up our trust with His timing, and when we do that, there's meaning. But without that trust in that timing, there's no meaning. So then in chapter 4 we see that oppression, again he's going back to a lens of looking at it without God, without trusting in God, and that the oppression, the people that are being oppressed, he's bringing out some bold language about better being dead, or better yet not being born yet, and things like that. So suffering, he deals with suffering, and again we can learn from the book of Job, like my series on Job, how that works. So what is the point of suffering? And Isaiah 53 gives us the ultimate suffering servant who died for on our behalf. Okay, so there we get answers to what suffering is all about, and the injustice of it, and then also the other side of it, that suffering will come to an end and everything will be made right. Like, for example, in chapter 3 we learned that God will call the past to account. So because God is both in time but also out of time, he's bringing everything to account that has happened. Okay, and he's going to judge everything. Okay, so everything is going to be made right. So yeah, we have to just trust in the sovereignty and goodness of God as we move forward in life. Okay, so some prayer focus we could do for chapter 4 is to pray for those who are suffering injustice. Now this is very painful, and we don't want to put on tougher expectations, or put on expectations on where they should be at faith wise and things like that. No, just pray for them, pray for comfort, for God to bring them comfort, because suffering, the injustice of suffering, there's a lot of layers in that, and we can't just write it off as someone didn't trust God at the right time, someone, or things like that. That's not something we should be thinking through when people are suffering. But we can pray for them to be comforted, pray for people to come around and bring them out of that season. Pray for God to reveal themselves in a specific way, those kind of things. Ask God to free you from envy and striving. That's an important thing for us, because when we build on our envious, our jealous tendencies, when we keep building on that, it just becomes more meaningless. Plus that'll continue to feed our lazy flesh. Okay, so the idea is to thank him for the people walking alongside you. Okay, who are the 2 or 3 people around you trust the most, that also trust you well, and you have that companionship with, and ask for deeper Christ-centered friendships. That's all I can say for now.